Hello, I'm Debanjan Chakravarti, Head of English Interface Program of British Council in India, and I'm in conversation with Adrian Tennant, who is a freelance training consultant, a writer, and a lot of other things too, Adrian. I just had a quick look at your biographical description, and you're a very keen crime fiction reader.
Yes, I read a lot of crime fiction. Usually I'm very interested in Scandinavian crime, and when I come to countries that are warm like India, I tend to bring ones that are set in the winter in the snow as a counterbalance. Yeah. And vice versa, when I go to cold places, I take books about India or elsewhere to give a balance.
What a life, Adrian. Adrian, talking about this particular conference, what kind of value do you see in a conference like this? Do they really help? Can they really help in improving the quality of teacher education in India and in the region as a whole?
Definitely. I think these kind of conferences have a number of different levels where they have value. The first is that they give participants the opportunity to actually engage and activate and think about things that they have read or things that have occurred in their contexts, and to try and actually place the theory within their own context, and also the opportunity to meet like-minded people. One of the biggest values of these conferences is the opportunity to network and learn from each other. So you might get somebody from Punjab talking to somebody from Tamil Nadu, talking to somebody from Sri Lanka, talking to somebody from the UK, and that opportunity is unmissable, and you can't replicate that in any other way. Of course you can do chats over the internet, but it's not the same as face-to-face opportunities and face-to-face conversations that you have with people. And in the long term, they actually have an impact on people's work and delivery back in the classroom or in whichever context they work. Even if they're policy makers, policy decision makers, they're interacting with people who they're making policies for, and they get direct feedback, they get direct input into that, and that can have a bigger effect on the impact that anything that we do in our field.
The theme of this conference, Adrian, was assessment and evaluation. How does that resonate with your own professional work that you do everywhere?
Well, I think first of all you have to look at the theme and ask why it's so important. And I think one of the reasons it's so important is because there's a tendency for it to be left till the last minute. People, when they're planning programs or planning teaching or planning any sort of educational program, tend to forget about assessing and evaluating that program, and it's a tag-on. So it's very important to highlight the importance of actually having an evaluation and assessment built into your program from the very start, knowing how you're going to assess, knowing where you're going, knowing what you want to assess. In terms of my work, it's incredibly important because although I'm not always involved in assessment type courses, as a materials writer, my materials are going to be used in classrooms to help children learn or adults learn English. So we have a clear outcome that we're aiming for, but we have to know how successful that outcome is. So we have to build in assessment within the material that we're writing. In terms of training, if I do a short program, I need to have a way of assessing not only the quality of that program, not only how much the participants got out of the program, but later on what impact that had on those participants in terms of their contexts. Recently in India I've been working on CCE.
Yes.
And that's...
I was about to ask you very specifically about that. But just if I can hold you a little bit on the point that we're discussing about the importance of assessment and evaluation, and then going back to the value you saw in a conference like this, is it always possible to map out outcomes in a very specific, measurable way?
No, it's not, and I don't think you always have to. You do have to have, you have to know what you would like to occur from a program. You have to think about how you're going to measure or evaluate the program, but you don't necessarily get the answers that you want. And sometimes you find that the questions you asked didn't actually give you the data that you were looking for, in which case go back to the drawing board and have a look at why and redesign. That in itself is a learning lesson for you. And there are areas where evaluating is very difficult. And I know that one of the panelists a couple of days ago was dismissing anecdotal evidence as not being valid enough or reliable enough. But sometimes there's no other way to get evidence other than through anecdotal evidence. How can you see what changes have occurred in somebody's attitude or mind and mindset and understanding of something? It might not be through direct application and observation and statistical data. There's a danger sometimes of relying on statistics and quantitative data rather than qualitative data, which is harder to get at.
Right. And Adrian, coming back to the thing that you raised a little bit earlier, that you have been working with several Indian states on developing a CCE framework for language teaching, especially in the primary section, I think. Can you tell us a little bit more about it? Is there a bit of confusion about what CCE means in the minds of policymakers in India? Are we not quite getting it right?
I don't think there's a confusion in the mind of policymakers. I think what we have are a couple of issues here. There is a mismatch between the theory and the reality of the classroom and the practices that go on in the classroom. I've noticed in some of the state documents talk about learner-centeredness, group work, activity-based, beautiful words, but the reality of the classroom is not necessarily reflected. And we need learner-centeredness, we need group work in order for CCE to work, because it doesn't work in a teacher-fronted context. So sometimes the actual classroom practice needs to, and the methodology of classroom practice needs to be addressed before we try and implement CCE, because otherwise we're doomed to failure, we're doomed to frustration, and if we frustrate people, then they won't be willing to try it out later on, even though it might be a good idea. The other thing is, I've noticed something that came up in the conference was Common European Framework, and talking about how that is meant to be a descriptive framework, and people are supposed to dip into it and take what they need for their context. But it's being misused. In many cases it's being used prescriptively. What I see is that the national policy for CCE is actually a descriptive framework of what people can do. So there are a number of tools that are mentioned, things like project work or presentations, but it doesn't mean that you have to apply all of them, and it doesn't mean that you have to prescriptively describe, implement CCE as it's described in the national documents, because that's not feasible. Course books aren't, textbooks aren't necessarily read in line with that. Teachers' methodology, teachers' language levels, actual classroom setups, the physical nature of the classroom isn't necessarily set up. It can be in rows, quite small confines and so on. And for example, at Standard 1 or Standard 2, the children don't learn to do presentations, so how are they supposed to do presentations for CCE? It doesn't apply to their context, their textbooks. So I think this is where there's a mismatch between the policy and the application or the implementation, is a misunderstanding from people who are meant to implement it of what they're actually meant to be implementing. And also a mismatch of what the policy makers think goes on in the classroom and the reality of the classroom. And I think that what I've been trying to do in the different states I've been working in is try to look at how we can get the theory of CCE.
Which other states you're working in, by the way?
So far I've been working in West Bengal, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, and this week, from tomorrow, I'm actually here in Andhra Pradesh, staying on here to do a course. And I see the same issues cropping up again and again in the different states. And my idea is that we need to look at the theory and work on how to put that into a practical application that allows the teachers on the ground, who might not have particularly good English, to actually implement a system in classes of 50, 60, 70 plus. And
you know, what are the particular sort of advantages that the states that you're working in have? I mean, could you sort of compare and contrast a little bit about your experience of working on CC in various states in India?
There are different issues in the different states, and of course the different states, the textbooks, there are actually quite close similarities in many respects to the textbooks that I've seen and been working with. But I have come across, you know, fairly different issues. In West Bengal, I was actually working with a group of people who had been involved in the textbook writing and had also been working with a consultant helping them in writing the textbooks. And so we had a much closer idea of mapping the CCE to the textbooks. And as they were teachers often or principals, again there was a much closer connection to the what's happening on the ground. In Tamil Nadu it's very interesting because of the 9 standards of textbooks that I saw. Each of the textbooks was written by a different group of people, and there was no communication between the different groups, and they were just following the syllabus rather than talking to each other. And so what we had were 9 completely different books. They weren't a series. They didn't fit together. They didn't link together. And that in itself threw up other challenges. And that was a very interesting project actually, because at the end of the course a number of the people who came up to me had been involved in, it was mostly textbook writers, and they said that the course was very interesting, very useful. We'd done a little session on materials development and materials writing, and they said they wished they'd had a course on materials writing before they wrote the materials, because now they had a better understanding of what they should have been doing. Bit like putting the cart before the horse. And I think there's a rush in many states to get CCE in or get communicative textbooks in, and sometimes this rush is counterproductive. It's not necessarily going to, in the long run, work. And what will happen again is another frustration of, well, this doesn't work. And a lot of it's to do with the implementation rather than the actual thing itself. Having said that, it's not an Indian problem. It is a problem in so many countries around the world, so many contexts that face the same problems, similar problems, from Cambodia to Indonesia to West Africa to Latin America. So it's not as though it's a problem unique to India or a problem which is of Indian making. It's a problem of a global world trying to keep up with itself.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for those thoughts, and thank you for speaking to us on camera.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.